What's up guys, I'm James for Kit Guru, and today I was hoping to bring you an update on the Seasonic Aura mod project, but unfortunately we've been hit with a slight delay on that that's out of our control. We will hopefully be back with a big update on that very soon, so make sure you stay tuned for that if that's what you're interested in. That does give us the opportunity though to look at some new all-in-one CPU coolers, and today we're taking a look at this very interesting new closed loop liquid cooler from bequiet. This is the pure loop. We got the 360mm version, but before we dive into that review, just let me quickly remind you guys who have not subscribed to the Kit Guru channel yet, make sure you do that today by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in other ways, head over to the Kit Guru store. You can pick up some cool merch, and don't forget there's always the kitguru.net website where you can catch up on all the latest hardware reviews and all the latest tech news. So when bequiet first introduced us to the new Pure Loop liquid cooler, both Leo and myself were really interested in this new pump design. As you can see, the pump isn't on the CPU block as usual. It's actually integrated into the tubing. Now both myself and Leo straight away thought this is a brand new revolutionary design and instantly wondered who the OEM is. This is obviously not just another Acertech rebranded product. bequiet were a little secretive actually about the OEM supplier, so we had to do a bit of our own digging to find out just where this design's come from, and it actually turns out that this design has been seen before. Enemax launched the Lick Fusion series in 2018, and that had this same tubing mounted pump setup. Other similarities between the two include the radiator. They both have a very similar shape to them with these grooves and these square end tanks on the radiators. And also the CPU block is exactly the same shape as the Enemax Lick Fusion. Well, the cold plate is the same plate, and it also has this nickel plated finish. And actually bequiet has just confirmed to us that the Pure Loop is supplied by a company called KD Industrial, and they have in fact supplied Enemax in the past before, so we can pretty much safely say that the Pure Loop is based on the same base design as the Enemax Lick Fusion. This is still a new setup to me. I've not tested an all-in-one CPU cooler with this pump setup before, so I'm really interested to see how it performs compared to the traditional CPU block mounted pump design. So according to bequiet, the main benefit of having this pump mounted on the tubing is to lower noise levels. It's a decoupled pump, it's in line with one of the tubes, and it has a speed range of up to 5,500 RPM. The pump is powered by a standard 3-pin fan header, but in the user manual, bequiet states that this must have a 12 volt, a constant 12 volt supply to it. So that means you don't have any adjustment of the pump speed if you want maximum performance. Another potential benefit of placing the pump into the tubing rather than at the CPU block is it allows the design of the CPU block to be a little more compact. bequiet has taken that approach a little. The block does look a little bit more compact compared to some other closed loop coolers with the pump integrated into the block, but I think they could have been a little bit more aggressive with the design. I do like the look of this block though. This top cover, this is actually plastic, but it has a really nice aluminium, brushed aluminium effect to it. It's hard to tell that this is actually plastic and not brushed aluminium. And you can see around the perimeter of that top cover, you've got a light diffuser for the LED lighting. There's a bequiet logo in the middle. The construction of the CPU block, majority of it's from plastic. It's quite a thick looking, durable plastic. Build quality seems good. And then at the base, you've got this nickel plated copper cold plate. That's an interesting feature as well. Not many closed loop coolers come with a nickel plated cold plate. It doesn't have great benefit, but it does allow you to then use this cooler possibly with liquid metal thermal compound. Obviously, liquid metal reacts slightly with copper, so a bare copper CPU block, which is what we normally see, you could have problems using liquid metal. Also, at the CPU block side, we've got articulating 90-degree fittings, so they can help you out when you're trying to maneuver the CPU block and install it onto the CPU. Just allows a bit of, movement of the tubing. It helps you orientate that CPU block a little easier. You can also see that the tubing, these are approximately 400mm long, and they're covered with this premium looking braided sleeving. That's common though nowadays with all-in-one CPU coolers. And then approximately 50mm from the radiator, you've got the pump mounted inside this plastic housing. I think we'll just take those screws out of that and have a look at the pump a little bit closer. So you can see there's two small Phillips screws at the top. And then two more Phillips screws at the bottom. And we just take that plastic cover off. And there you can see it's just a pretty basic inline pump. It has a speed range of, like I said, up to 5,500 RPM. There's not a lot of information on the pump. We've just got a KD logo, so I guess that is the manufacturer of the pump. As you can see, the tubing looks like it's just pushed onto two barbed fittings. There's no clamps that hold it in position. It's a pretty tight fit, so I don't expect that to come loose or leak or anything like that. So yeah, that's pretty basic design, but bequiet says that it is extremely quiet, so it's going to be interesting to see how this performs compared to a more traditional all-in-one CPU cooler with the pump mounted on the CPU block. So the braided sleeving, that continues right up to the radiator, and you can see at the radiator side the tubing is fixed, so there's no rotation available there. And then the radiator is pretty typical of closed loop coolers. It's an aluminium radiator, 27mm thick. It's got a dense, fin arrangement. The tanks on either end are pretty square. I like these square designs. Another very interesting feature of the Pure Loop is, as you can see, at the end tank at this side, there's a screw there. That's obviously a fill port. Now, normally, manufacturers of closed loop coolers, they don't want you messing with the fill port. In fact, they often put a warranty void sticker over there, but bequiet are actually encouraging users to remove that fill port. They include inside the packaging a 100ml bottle of coolant, and they also say that you should be topping up or refilling this system every 2 years to prolong the life. So I think that'll probably please quite a few people. There is a certain amount of evaporation that happens inside a closed loop cooler, and often when that coolant does evaporate, that is more or less the end of the life of the cooler. Not the case with the Pure Loop, because you can refill it. So that's everything we know about the cooler. Included inside the box are 3 of these bequiet Pure Wings 2 fans. We've obviously seen these before on plenty of the bequiet air coolers, but these are actually the high-speed version, so these run up to 2,000 RPM, ideal for use with the radiators. They'll obviously emit a bit more noise than the standard fans, but they're still really quiet. You also get the user manual installation guide. It's quite a detailed manual, that, with some really clear images. And there is the bottle of coolant that you get with the cooler. That's a 100ml top-up bottle, and that is just a typical water and propylene glycol mixture. We also have a bag full of installation hardware. There's one bag labelled Intel with all kinds of installation standoff screws, mounting brackets. There's a universal backplate in that bag as well, and some upper mounting brackets. And then there's a bag labelled AMD. So that's obviously the installation hardware for AMD, AM3 and AM4 platforms. There's a small tube of thermal compound. The cooler doesn't come with any thermal compound pre-applied, so that's all you get. It's probably maybe just enough for 2 installations. There's also a bag that includes a SATA power adapter. That's for connecting the CPU block and the pump to 12 volts. And also in that bag there is a 3-way 4-pin PWM fan splitter. There's another bag with some screws for the fan, so there's both the long and the small screws in there. And then you get a few zip ties as well there to neaten up your cables with. So that's everything that's included. This is obviously the 360mm version. This is available to purchase now from places like Overclockers, for around £120, which sounds like great value. There is other sizes available. This also comes in a 120mm, 240mm and 280mm versions. Obviously the price decreases as you go down the size range. The reason we've chosen an Intel platform to show you the installation, it's not that we're biased towards Intel or anything like that, it's just simply because our current test bench uses an Intel 1151 based motherboard with this Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Extreme. AMD installation should be very similar. In fact, it should be more straightforward than the Intel installation because the AMD installation retains the stock backplate. With Intel installation, you need to use this bequiet universal backplate, and the only tool you need to complete the installation is a Phillips screwdriver. So the first thing you need to do on a Intel installation using the 115X platform is take these standoffs, there's 4 of these, and just poke those through the holes in the backplate. For 115X you want to use a hole closest to the center of the CPU, and then to retain the standoffs to the backplate you just need to slide over these rubber O-rings so that they fit into the groove on the standoff. So there you go, that's what the backplate should look like once you have all the 4 standoffs in place, and you can see that they're held in position with those rubber O-rings. You then just need to put the backplate on the back of the motherboard, align it with the holes, put it into position. Then you just need to take the 115X standoffs and then just screw these in place. Just make sure that the insulating washer is facing the motherboard. You can use your Phillips screwdriver just to nip these up a bit. You don't have to go too daft with the tightening of those, you can just do them up by hand or just snug them up with the screwdriver. You then need to take the 115X upper mounting brackets, again using the innermost holes, just align those with the standoffs, and then using these Phillips screws, these short Phillips screws, just tighten the upper mounting brackets in position. So for the next step, we'll fit the fans to the radiator. You might want to delay this step until you work out the positioning of the radiator inside your case, but there's only one way around that it can be installed on our test bench. So we'll take the fans and install them in a push configuration. So simply just place those on top of the radiator and then tighten them down using these long black screws. There's 12 of these screws in total. I'll leave a few out because 3 of these screws are used to fix the cooler to the test bench. So these just need tightening down until they're nice and snug. So there's the fans installed to the radiator. As you can see, I've just left those 3 screws out because they'll be used to fix the cooler onto our test bench. There you see, now the radiator is mounted on the test bench. It's a little bit wobbly on this homemade test bench, but it does the job. So the next thing we need to do is just apply some thermal compound to the CPU heat spreader. I like to just put a blob in the middle and a few smaller blobs in the corners just to make sure that we get good coverage of thermal compound on the CPU. Then you just need to make sure you remove this warning sticker from the base of the CPU block. Lower that CPU block down so that the screws are aligned with the mounting holes. Tighten up these 2 screws that hold the CPU block in position. Try and tighten them up progressively and evenly, so just do them a little bit at a time each. That just helps to spread the mounting pressure across the CPU evenly, and it helps spread out that thermal compound and get a good CPU block to CPU contact. Just make sure they're nicely nipped up with the screwdriver, and then you can see that that's nice and solidly fixed in position. So in the user manual it states that the pump needs a permanent 12 volt power supply. bequiet include this SATA adapter, so it's a standard 3-pin header, or there's 2 standard 3-pin headers on one side and then a standard SATA power connection on the other. And in the user manual it tells you to connect up the pump and the LED lighting that comes from the CPU block to this SATA power connector. And then you just need to connect up the SATA power adapter to a spare SATA power connector coming from the power supply. Obviously, with that kind of setup, with that constant 12 volt supply, it means that there's no adjustment to the pump speed. You could potentially connect that pump to a motherboard header and obviously then be able to mess around with the speed of the pump, but according to bequiet, the pump's very quiet when it's operating at its full speed, so there shouldn't be any reason to turn down the speed of that pump at all. And then finally, to complete the installation, all we need to do is take this 3-way PWM fan splitter and then just connect that up to the 4-pin PWM cables coming from the fans. Then finally we just need to connect up the other end of the splitter cable to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. On our Gigabyte motherboard that is labelled as CPU_fan. And that is it. That is the installation complete. It's not difficult at all. If you've installed a bequiet air cooler before, you'll probably find some of the initial preparation of the motherboard very familiar. It uses the same brackets as the DotRock Pro 4 and the DotRock 4. So it is overall a really simple installation. It takes probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes at most, and even the most novice PC user or enthusiast shouldn't find it difficult at all. It's really simple. Because bequiet doesn't provide any fan control software with the Pure Loop, your options are to either use the motherboard BIOS or to use the motherboard software. With this Gigabyte motherboard, we can use the System Information Viewer software to control the fan speeds. So we just click on the Smart Fan 5 Auto tab, and that lets you switch between either quiet, standard, performance, or full speed profile. So obviously, whichever one of those you choose, it adjusts the fan speeds for either performance or for noise levels. Alternatively, you can use the Smart Fan 5 Advanced tab. On here you can either set a fixed RPM for the fans, or you can create your own fan curve, and that means that the fan speed will adjust automatically depending on CPU temperature. Then in terms of lighting effects, there's no RGB with the bequiet Pure Loop, and that's to be expected with bequiet. I think they only have one case that has RGB lighting on. None of the previous coolers have had RGB lighting. You've just got this plain white LED lighting. I quite like the look of that actually. With the lights dimmed a little, you can see just how bright that white lighting is. It is really nice and bright, and it's nice and even as well. There's no kind of LED hotspots around that diffuser. In fact, I've actually set both the motherboard lighting and the memory modules to white, and the bequiet looks a much nicer, brighter, clearer white than either of the motherboard or the memory lighting. So that's all the features, the design and the installation of the cooler covered. I guess all that's left to do now is to measure the thermal performance. To do that, we'll use our usual thermal performance test using this Z390 platform with an Intel Core i9-9900KS CPU. That's obviously a very powerful CPU still, and it produces a lot of heat. To begin with, we'll have the fans set at their maximum RPM and then run an IDA 64 stress test and measure the average temperatures during the test using HW Info. We'll set the CPU at 4 GHz across all cores and then move up to 4.7 GHz, and then finally an overclock test at 5.1 GHz. And then we'll move on to our noise normalized test, where we configure the fan speeds to limit the noise output to 40 decibels. Throughout testing, all the figures shown on screen will be presented as delta temperatures. That means that the ambient room temperature has been deducted from the actual CPU reading. In our initial test at 4 GHz, you can see that the Pure Loop 360 offers solid thermal performance, recording 36.1 degrees average delta temperature. And then in our second test with the CPU configured to 4.7 GHz across all cores, again the Pure Loop 360 thermal performance is solid, recording a 52.5 degrees average delta temperature. It's not quite hitting the thermal performance levels of the much more expensive NZXT Kraken X73, but that's what we'd expect from a 360mm cooler in this price range. Then in our final raw thermal performance test with the fans at maximum RPM and our CPU cranked up to 5.1 GHz across all cores, again it's a solid showing for the Pure Loop 360, recording 62.9 degrees average delta temperature, and it outperforms other 240mm coolers and some other 280mm coolers as we would expect. And then in our noise normalized test, again, we're seeing solid results from the Pure Loop 360. It records 53.8 degrees average delta temperature, which is only just an increase of 1 degrees over the test when the fans were running at full speed. So that is quite impressive, and again, it's solid performance, and as we'd expect from a 360mm cooler in this price range. And then in terms of the maximum noise levels, as we'd expect from a Be Quiet product, the noise levels are at the lower end of the scale. They're not quite as low as some of the Be Quiet air coolers, but that is down to the fact that the Pure Loop 360 uses the high-speed version of these Pure Wings 2 fans. But even at their maximum 2000 RPM, the Pure Wings 2 fans show that they are considerably quieter than competitors' fans with a similar RPM. So overall, there's a lot to like about the Pure Loop 360. The thermal performance is pretty solid for this price range. The appearance of the cooler is a personal favourite of mine. I really like the look of that CPU block. I like this curved top cover and that brushed aluminium effect. Build quality of the cooler seems to be really high, even though it's not a highly priced product. That's again is typical with Be Quiet products. You know you're going to get a well-built product. The fact that this pump has been moved to the tubing away from the CPU block, it doesn't seem to have a negative impact on performance. It is extremely quiet, but nowadays all-in-one CPU coolers, the pumps are that well optimized, they are generally pretty quiet anyway. The cooler has all the features of a more premium product, braided tubing, these articulating fittings at the base of the cooler, 27mm and aluminium rad, everything you would get from probably more expensive products. The advantages of having this pump over here on the tubing obviously means that there's less wiring around the CPU block, and again, because there's no additional software, that means there's no extra USB cables, there's no proprietary fan cables or anything like that. So the actual finished installed product looks really neat and tidy. I'm a big fan of that. I don't really like all these extra unnecessary cables that you tend to get with a lot of all-in-one CPU coolers, so that makes me happy. The fact that you can refill this cooler as well, that seems like a positive for me. I know not everybody wants to mess around with water and electrics, and you know, I can understand that. It's probably best to completely remove the cooler to refill it, and hopefully, as Be Quiet says, the fact that you can refill it should extend the cooler's lifespan, and if you do see any degradation with the performance, then it might be worth checking the levels of that and filling it up. Be Quiet does recommend to check it every 2 years. And the only real negatives I can see with this cooler, for some people, the lack of RGB lighting may be a problem. Personally, I really like that, just that plain white LED lighting. And for those of you that may not be confident with messing around in the BIOS, setting the fan curves, the lack of software for the fan configuration may be an issue. For someone like myself, that's not much of a problem, but you know, it's obviously less experienced users may find a more user-friendly piece of software such as the Corsair IQ software or something like that easier to use than messing around with the BIOS. And if you are struggling with setting up your fans using the motherboard BIOS, I'd suggest heading over to the motherboard vendor's website. They probably have some fan configuration software that might be a little bit more user-friendly. As I touched on earlier in the review, you can pick up the Pure Loop 360 for around £120 now in the UK. That sounds like really good value. You can be paying anything up to and above £200 for closed loop 360mm coolers these days. Personally, I wouldn't hesitate to use this in one of my own systems. I like the way the cooler looks. I like that subtle design with the mostly black and brushed aluminium. Thermal performance is solid, and obviously being a bequiet product, you've got low noise levels as well. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope you've enjoyed watching our review of the bequiet Pure Loop 360. If you have, then you know what to do. Give us a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and if you want to help support us in other ways, head over to the Kit Guru store where you can pick up some cool merch. And obviously there's always the kitguru.net website where you can catch up on all the latest hardware reviews and all the latest tech news. And you can connect with us on our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and through our Discord channel. I've been James for Kit Guru. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.